By now, we are all frustratingly aware of how many simpable characters there are in Breath of the Wild. I definitely have a few favorites, but the Great Fairies take the cake for me. And for some reason, this one in particular wins out over all the rest. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crossing Crafts. Today we will be sculpting Malanya, the horse god. Now let's get to work crafting this absolute freak whom I love so dearly. First things first, we're going to start the base, which is the same model across all of the Great Fairies, with the only difference being the color schemes. Right now I want a big enough circle, so this won't do. Neither will this. Perfect. This may seem a tad big for a miniature model, but there's a lot of decor on the inside of the fountain, so it'll seem a lot smaller when we start adding everything. And now that it's all cut out, we can start attaching the mushroom petals. The Great Fairy fountains have some thick mushroom petals that start at a downward slope but eventually turn upright as you get to the back of the model, so I had to bake it every couple of petals to retain the shape. They are also, as I said, very well fed, so I had to use a considerable amount of clay to make it look right and accurate to the model in game. I attach each petal to the circle, smoothing and shaping them along the way until I'm pretty happy with the general shape of it all. Now that the petals are done, we can move on to the medallions and other carved ornaments that rest at the back of the fountain. As you can see here, there's quite a bit of filigree for this build, so I'm cutting out the shapes as close as I can and carving some detail into each piece before I can attach it to the base. This part took quite a while, but it turned out good enough, which means I can shape it around the base and add the rest of the filigree. I'm going to cut out sheets of clay and carve them in a similar fashion to connect the triangular border that goes about halfway around the fountain. And when I'm done with that, I can make the ornamental perches that will sit right behind that border. Once I have those sculpted and secured, I can finish attaching the border, smooth it out, and move on to those cute little dimpled mushrooms. To make these, I'm going to take many foil balls and cover them in an even layer of clay before pressing down in the center with one of my tools. Then it's just a matter of repeating that process until I have an even circle of mushrooms. Once they're all in place, I give them a cursory smooth with my fingers and voila! To continue our mushroom sculpting crusade, it's time to adorn the model with the pathway of mushrooms that are present at the front. To start, I'm adding the stem of the biggest mushroom and setting aside a large mushroom cap, which I will secure on after adding some more spores right under it. This was one of my favorite parts of the build because sculpting tiny, adorable mushrooms is an absolute delight. After finishing the front path, I wanted to add a bit of texture to the mushrooms, so I'm using this soft wire brush on all the bigger areas and this smaller wire brush to get the harder to reach areas. Now I'm going to add the rest of the mushrooms that are placed kind of at random around the model, though I tried to be relatively accurate between where the game has them and where I place them. Once those are all in place, I shall wipe these birds into existence, and the fountain itself is all good to go. Now we can work on our off-putting yet weirdly charming man fairy, and we're going to start by building an armature. He's part human, part horse, part floating fabric, and we shall start with the fabric portion. I never knew Malanya was a man, and to my knowledge the only male Great Fairy, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, until I read his section in Creating a Champion. Anyway, back to business. Now I'm adding strips of clay and indenting them wherever different fabrics will meet each other. With his strips of fabric separated, I can start adding the bones which make up his neck. To sculpt the vertebra, all I'm doing is rolling out a disc of clay, cutting a circle in the middle, and making a few choice cuts to transform it into a piece of his spine. Once I have the general shape, I can wrap it around his neck and blend it from the top up. Looking pretty good. Now we can add the ponytails that hang from each vertebra, and this was really easy, so all I'm doing is rolling out some cones and adding a band around the top. I texture it to look like a tuft of horsehair and connect it to the spine through a wire that I stick in the middle of each one. Now that he's got a sick hairdo, I'm going to carve out his horse mask. I did the mask first so I can make the right size dome that will connect his spine and the mask. To make this dome, I'm taking a ball of aluminum secured with wire, covering it in clay, and pressing it down through his spinal column. There's a lot of detail on this fairy's cranium, so first things first, I'm going to layer down some more horsehair. I'm going to add his bandana and a couple more pieces of hair before starting on his accessories. I start with the green strings that hang from his bandana, and then I move on to sculpt the 2 long braids that hang right behind his horse mask. I texture them so it doesn't look like I glued stray pieces of ramen to my sculpture, and then I make the feather on each side of his head. With all the accessories ready to be applied and the hair all done, you might notice our horse god appears to have some extra spine since you last saw him. The reason being is his head fell off in the oven, so a couple more vertebrae secured it much better. And with a new neck, I can confidently attach all of his head accessories without fear. I'm going to work from the back to the front, so I add the 4 strings on each side of his head before adding his feathers. And once those are on, I can finish up Malanya's hair by attaching his braids and moving on to oh, that could have been bad, let's be a bit more delicate, to attach the stitching on his clothes. For this, all I had to do was get a really thin roll of clay and cut small pieces to stick in between the divots I made earlier. When I'm done adding the stitching, I can add his horseshoe necklace and his choker. Now we can move on to his hands, and the book I'm using as reference described them as bony and sinewy. Didn't know that one. Hands are the bane of my existence when they have to look human, so I struggled with these, but I'd say they get a passing grade, which has been good enough for me my entire life. In the game, his hands are actually completely detached and floating from his body, so I opted to sculpt them holding onto his fountain instead of attaching them with a thin wire or something like that. With all of the elements sculpted and baked, we can move on to painting the fountain, which I'll start by giving it a few coats of a vibrant purple. Moving on to the medallions, I'm giving them a yellow base coat so I can give them a heaping serving of gold paint. Don't hold your breath waiting for more footage of me painting this part, as it took me an unholy amount of coats to look opaque. With that part out of our minds, we can paint the dimpled mushrooms that line the inside of the fountain. And before I forget, I have to paint the pearls on the 3 medallions. I gave them a base coat of white and added another coat of pearl over top. Next, I'm adding a bit of faux water texture because I'm going to add a little bit of resin to the bottom on the inside of the fountain, and I didn't want it to look too still and stagnant. Now we can move on to painting the mushrooms, and as you can see, our model took a bit of damage with some of the mushrooms falling off, but that's no big deal because I can just paint them separately and glue them on later. Now these mushrooms were as much of a delight to paint as they were to sculpt, so I put the utmost care in giving them all a light tan underside and bright colorful tops consisting of blues, oranges, yellows, and pinks. This one here is my favorite for some reason, and I haven't been able to give it a name, so comment down below what I should name it, and while you're at it, hit the subscribe button. I put a ton of effort and love into these videos, so if you don't, you might incur Malanya's wrath. I only jest. Now back to the video. Next up on our to-do list is painting on the light purple spots that are all over the mushroom petals. Once that's all done, we can paint the horse god himself. Beginning with his clothing, I tried to remain as accurate as I could with what colors go where, and after painting a few coats for each color, I painted the patterns in and made the stitching white. Moving on to his luscious locks, Malanya's hair alternates from light beige to brown, so I did that color combo on his ponytails as well as the hair on his head. With the hair done, it's time to move on to smaller details and accessories like his bandana and his jewelry. For the horseshoe, I'm painting on the jewel and adding the world's tiniest dollop of UV resin to add that dimension. Once the orange base had dried for the bandana, I painted the Triforce pattern on it and I could move on to paint the strings that hang off of it a gorgeous green. The string is attached to the bandana via some metal rings, so I gave those a gray base coat before using some metallic gunmetal gray to add some shine. I then paint the base of the feathers tan, and I add the light gray and dark gray sections to the bottom. Both the feathers and the braids have some decorative bands, so I'm making the center a super bright cerulean and the rims a really gorgeous scarlet. Painting the mask was quite straightforward as I had already added the wooden texture onto the clay, so I just did one coat of brown and I let the minor patchiness in the color work as some weathering. After painting the forehead and nose a darker pink, I could add all the rest of the detail to the mask. The last thing to paint are both of Malanya's hands and all of his nails before I can pour the resin and sit our beautiful horse god inside of his fountain. After a considerable amount of work, I better quit fooling around and get to the main event. Here is Malanya the horse god. Aw, why the long face? Even though this video is over, I have other videos on my channel you're welcome to watch, so take the reins and don't say nay to liking, subscribing, and checking out my other videos. I'm truly so sorry about all these nightmare-ish puns, but don't hold it against me so I can see you in next week's video. Bye bye!